Jake Martinez had always believed that coffee was humanity's greatest invention, right up until the moment it became his worst enemy. See, most 19-year-olds worry about college finals or student loans. Jake got to worry about accidentally causing the biggest diplomatic incident in galactic history. All because he couldn't navigate a space station corridor while carrying a tray of maintenance supplies and a steaming cup of Earth's finest caffeine. The collision happened in slow motion, naturally. 1 second he's walking down the pristine hallway of the Galactic Council headquarters, minding his own business as a lowly maintenance tech. The next second, he's sprawled on the floor watching his coffee arc through the air like some kind of caffeinated meteor, heading straight for 3 very important, very angry aliens. Chancellor Vex took the worst of it. The pompous purple slug-like creature had been wearing what Jake later learned were the sacred ceremonial robes of diplomatic immunity, passed down through 17 generations of galactic bureaucrats. Now they were sacred ceremonial rags of caffeinated catastrophe. "You have defiled the ancient garments," Vex shrieked, his voice reaching octaves that probably violated several noise ordinances. Purple slime oozed from his pores when he got excited, which was apparently happening right now. Gross. Commander Thrak, who looked like someone had crossed a rhino with a particularly grumpy drill sergeant, stepped forward with all the subtlety of a meteor impact. "This human whelp has insulted the dignity of the council. He must face justice." Judge Quinn, the third member of their little tribunal of overreaction, simply stared at Jake with cold, multifaceted eyes. She resembled a praying mantis that had been stretched through a taffy machine and given a law degree. "The penalty for desecrating sacred artifacts is clear," she said in a voice like breaking glass. "Trial by combat in the Kythara arena." Jake blinked. "Wait, what? It's just coffee. I can pay for dry cleaning." The 3 aliens exchanged looks that clearly said primitive human doesn't understand the gravity of his situation. Which was probably true, because Jake was still trying to figure out how spilling a beverage had escalated to what sounded suspiciously like a death sentence. "The Kythara arena," Vex explained with the kind of theatrical relish that suggested he'd been waiting his whole slimy life for this moment, "is where we test the worthiness of those who would challenge galactic law. You will face Doomclaw, the apex predator of the Zerion system. A creature of such terrible ferocity that it has remained undefeated for 50 cycles. 50 cycles of what?" Jake asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to know the answer. 50 cycles of combat. Thrak rumbled with obvious satisfaction. 50 cycles of glorious battle. 50 cycles of watching challengers become lunch. Judge Quinn's mandibles clicked in what might have been alien laughter. "No being has ever survived an encounter with Doomclaw. The creature is perfection incarnate. A killing machine honed by decades of combat." Jake looked around at the gathered crowd of aliens who had stopped to watch the proceedings. They were all nodding sagely, like this was perfectly reasonable. Like coffee spillage naturally led to being fed to some kind of space monster. "Right," Jake said slowly, "so my options are what exactly?" "Face Doomclaw with honor," Vex declared. "Or face Doomclaw as a coward. The choice is yours but the outcome remains the same." Jake had to admire their commitment to the bit. These aliens had apparently built an entire judicial system around feeding people to a pet monster, and they were treating it like the height of civilized behavior. It would have been almost impressive if it wasn't completely insane. "When do I get my lawyer?" he asked. All 3 aliens stared at him blankly. "My advocate, legal representation. Due process." Jake tried different terms, but their expressions didn't change. "Come on. You guys have to have some kind of legal system that doesn't involve monsters eating people." "The arena is our legal system," Judge Quinn explained patiently, like she was talking to a particularly slow child. "Doomclaw serves as judge, jury, and executioner. It is the most efficient court in the galaxy." Jake couldn't argue with that logic, mainly because it was so completely divorced from anything resembling actual logic that his brain had temporarily shut down in self-defense. This was definitely not covered in the maintenance worker orientation manual. The Kythera arena turned out to be exactly as over-the-top as Jake had expected from a species that considered monster fighting a legitimate form of jurisprudence. The place was enormous, carved from black stone and filled with thousands of cheering aliens who had apparently bought tickets to watch him get eaten, because nothing said advanced civilization like selling snacks at an execution. Jake found himself standing on a platform high above the arena floor, wearing what the guards had cheerfully called ceremonial combat attire, which was basically a loincloth. Because apparently when you're about to become monster food, dignity is optional. "Behold." Chancellor Vex's voice boomed through hidden speakers, reaching every corner of the massive coliseum. "The human who dared defile our sacred traditions." The crowd booed with enthusiasm. Jake gave them a sarcastic wave, because if you're going to die horribly you might as well have fun with it. He shall face the judgment of Doomclaw. Vex continued, working the crowd like a twisted game show host. The apex predator. The unstoppable force. The creature that has never known defeat. A massive gate at the far end of the arena began to grind open, and Jake got his first look at his executioner. Doomclaw was, without question, the most terrifying thing Jake had ever seen. 12 feet tall and covered in midnight black scales that gleamed like armor. 6 legs ending in claws the size of baseball bats. Multiple eyes that glowed like red coals. A mouth full of teeth that looked like they'd been designed by someone with serious anger management issues. The creature emerged from its tunnel with slow, deliberate steps, and the crowd went absolutely wild. This was clearly the main event they'd all been waiting for. Jake swallowed hard. Okay, he muttered to himself. This is fine. This is totally fine. Just a giant murder lizard with more teeth than a hardware store. No big deal. The platform beneath his feet suddenly tilted, and Jake found himself sliding down a chute like the world's worst water park ride. He hit the arena floor hard, rolled to his feet, and came face to face with Doomclaw. The beast stared at him. Jake stared back. The crowd held its breath, and then Doomclaw did something that absolutely nobody had expected. It tilted its massive head to one side, and made a sound that was unmistakably curious. Almost like a question. Then it took a step closer and did something that nearly gave Jake a heart attack. It sniffed him. Not the aggressive predatory sniffing of a hunter sizing up prey. This was the gentle inquisitive sniffing of a creature that had just encountered something interesting and wanted to know more about it. Jake said intelligently. Good boy. Doomclaw's tail started wagging. The crowd's cheering faltered and died as their legendary apex predator lowered its massive head and nudged Jake's hand with what could only be described as affection. Sit. Jake said experimentally, not really expecting anything to happen. Doomclaw immediately planted its rear end on the arena floor and looked up at Jake expectantly. The silence in the arena was deafening. Stay, Jake commanded, holding up his hand. Doomclaw stayed, its tail thumping against the ground like a drum. Jake looked up at the stands, where thousands of aliens were staring in shock. Chancellor Vex's mouth was hanging open so wide that Jake could see his tonsils. Commander Thrak looked like someone had just told him that war was actually optional. Judge Quinn's multifaceted eyes were blinking in a pattern that suggested her brain was trying to reboot. So, Jake called out, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. Does this mean I win, or do we need to work on more tricks first? Because I'm pretty sure he's smart enough to learn rollover. Doomclaw's tail wagged harder, and Jake could swear the creature was smiling. It took about 5 minutes for Jake to realize that Doomclaw wasn't just friendly. He was desperately lonely. The way the massive creature pressed against Jake's side, careful not to knock him over with his bulk, reminded Jake of every abandoned dog he'd ever seen at the animal shelter. Except this particular abandoned dog could probably bench press a tank. How long have you been down here, buddy? Jake asked, scratching behind what he assumed were Doomclaw's ears. The creature made a sound like a contented rumble that shook the arena floor. The answer, as Jake pieced together over the next hour while the crowd gradually dispersed in confusion, was pretty much Doomclaw's entire life. The beast had been captured as a hatchling from the Zerion system 50 years ago, brought to the arena as a baby, and raised in isolation to be the perfect killing machine. Except nobody had bothered to check if Doomclaw actually wanted to be a killing machine. Turns out, when you're a highly intelligent creature with the emotional capacity of a golden retriever, spending 5 decades alone in a cave tends to make you a little desperate for companionship. So let me get this straight, Jake said, sharing his meager lunch ration with his new friend. Doomclaw delicately took the protein bar between 2 claws, careful not to accidentally remove Jake's hand in the process. They brought you here as a baby, locked you up, and then acted surprised when you got excited about finally having someone to play with. Doomclaw nodded, which was disturbing on several levels. First, because it meant he understood every word Jake was saying. Second, because it meant 50 years of challengers had been fed to what was essentially a confused, oversized puppy who just wanted someone to be nice to him. That's messed up, even by alien standards, Jake muttered. He looked up at the viewing boxes where the council members were having what appeared to be a heated argument. Chancellor Vex was gesticulating wildly, purple slime flying everywhere. Commander Thrak kept pointing at Jake and Doomclaw like they were somehow cheating. Judge Quinn just looked confused, which Jake was beginning to suspect was her default expression. They're probably trying to figure out how to spin this, Jake told Doomclaw. Can't have their perfect justice system looking ridiculous because their apex predator turned out to be a big softy. Doomclaw made an indignant noise and showed Jake his claws, which were indeed terrifying. Then he gently used one claw to scratch an itch behind his ear, completely undermining the intimidation factor. "Yeah, I know you're tough," Jake said, "but you're also basically a giant therapy dog, aren't you?" Over the next few hours, Jake learned that Doomclaw was not only intelligent but incredibly observant. The creature had spent 50 years watching the arena's operations, memorizing guard rotations, studying the mechanical systems, and mapping every tunnel and passage in the complex. He just never had a reason to use that knowledge before. "You know," Jake said thoughtfully, "I bet you could get us out of here if you wanted to." Doomclaw tilted his head and made a questioning noise. "I mean, they can't just leave us down here forever, right? Eventually they're going to have to do something. And when they do," Jake grinned. "Well, let's just say I'm starting to think these aliens aren't quite as smart as they think they are." The confidence was new for Jake. Back home, he'd always been the guy who fixed things when they broke, not the guy who broke things when they needed fixing. But there was something about being thrown into an alien gladiator pit that really put your regular problems into perspective. Plus, having a 12-foot-tall best friend with claws like swords didn't hurt his confidence levels either. "You know what the funny thing is?" Jake said, leaning against Doomclaw's warm flank. "They keep calling you an apex predator, but I bet you've never actually killed anyone, have you?" Doomclaw shook his massive head sadly. "Just scared them into submission, right? And then what happened to the challengers?" Doomclaw pointed with one claw toward a section of the arena wall. Jake followed his gaze and saw what looked like a hidden door, barely visible in the stonework. "You've been helping them escape," Jake realized. "This whole time you've been pretending to be their big scary monster while secretly letting people go free." The creature's tail started wagging again, and Jake couldn't help but laugh. Here he'd been worried about facing a bloodthirsty killer, when in reality he'd been matched up with the galaxy's most considerate mass murderer. "Well," Jake said, standing up and dusting off his ridiculous ceremonial loincloth, "I think it's time we returned the favor." The next morning, Jake woke up to find Doomclaw staring at him with what could only be described as excitement. The massive creature had apparently spent the night thinking, and judging by the elaborate series of scratches he'd carved into the arena floor, he'd come up with something resembling a blueprint. "Is this a map?" Jake asked, studying the markings. Doomclaw nodded enthusiastically, and began pointing with his claws, making a series of clicks and rumbles that Jake was beginning to understand as actual communication. The layout was impressive. Doomclaw had mapped out the entire arena complex, including areas Jake was pretty sure the guards didn't know existed. Maintenance tunnels, old drainage systems, forgotten storage rooms, and most importantly, a direct route to the council chambers. "You want us to go up there?" Jake asked, pointing to the section marked with what looked like tiny alien stick figures. "That's either really brave or really stupid." Doomclaw made a sound that Jake interpreted as why not both. The plan as Jake understood it was beautifully simple. The arena's security system was apparently run by the same species that thought feeding people to monsters was peak justice, which meant it had some serious design flaws. The whole complex ran on a central power grid that could be accessed through the maintenance tunnels Doomclaw had mapped out over the decades. "Let me get this straight," Jake said, tracing the route with his finger. "You want me to crawl through 50-year-old ventilation shafts to reach a power junction that controls the entire facility?" Doomclaw nodded. "And while I'm doing that, you're going to create a distraction down here." Another nod, this one accompanied by what Jake could only describe as a mischievous grin. "What kind of distraction are we talking about?" Doomclaw stood up, walked to the center of the arena, and let out a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. Then he began what could only be described as a temper tantrum. He thrashed his tail, clawed at the walls, and generally carried on like the apex predator everyone thought he was. Within minutes, guards were pouring into the observation areas, emergency lights were flashing, and Jake could hear Chancellor Vex's panicked voice over the intercom system, demanding to know what was happening to their prized asset. "Okay," Jake said admiringly, "that'll definitely get their attention." The real genius of the plan became clear as Jake squeezed into the first maintenance tunnel. The aliens had built their arena to contain a monster, not to keep a determined human maintenance worker from accessing their infrastructure. Jake had spent 3 years crawling through worse spaces on Earth, fixing everything from air conditioning units to fiber optic cables. These alien systems, they were laughably primitive. The power junction was exactly where Doomclaw had indicated, and Jake almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. The entire facility was controlled by what looked like a slightly more advanced version of a car's electrical system. No redundancies, no security protocols, and absolutely no consideration for what might happen if someone who actually knew what they were doing got their hands on it. "They conquered space travel with this," Jake muttered, pulling out his multi-tool. "No wonder they think coffee is a weapon of mass destruction." He got to work, rerouting power systems and accessing what passed for the arena's computer network. It was almost insultingly easy. The aliens had apparently never heard of firewalls, encryption, or basic cybersecurity. Their entire system was held together with the digital equivalent of duct tape and wishful thinking. 20 minutes later, Jake had complete control of the arena's infrastructure. Lights, doors, communication systems, even the atmospheric controls. He felt like a kid who'd been handed the keys to his favorite toy store. The first thing he did was unlock every door in the complex. The second thing he did was activate the emergency broadcast system that was supposed to be used for evacuation announcements. Instead, he patched it into the arena's main viewing feed, and started broadcasting everything happening in the council chambers directly to the entire galactic network. Because it turned out that when aliens build a gladiator arena for entertainment purposes, they make sure it has really good cameras. Down in the arena proper, Doomclaw had stopped his fake rampage, and was looking up at the observation deck with what Jake could swear was anticipation. The massive creature had somehow managed to position himself perfectly to block the main exit from the council chambers. Jake's voice echoed through the complex as he spoke into the emergency broadcast system. "Attention citizens of the galaxy. This is Jake Martinez, the human who spilled coffee on some very important robes. I'm here to tell you what your galactic council doesn't want you to know about their justice system." Through the cameras, Jake could see Chancellor Vex frantically pressing buttons on his control panel, trying to cut the feed. Commander Thrak was shouting orders at guards who couldn't get to their posts because all the doors were locked. Judge Quinn was just standing there looking confused, which Jake was beginning to realize was probably her only setting. "See that big scary monster down there?" Jake continued, zooming the camera in on Doomclaw, who obligingly sat down and wagged his tail. "That's Doomclaw, your apex predator. He's about as dangerous as a golden retriever with separation anxiety. Watch this." Jake triggered a pre-recorded whistle sound through the speakers. Doomclaw immediately perked up, trotted over to where Jake had hidden some food earlier, and brought it back to his favorite spot like he was playing fetch. The crowd noise from the viewing areas was getting louder as word spread. This wasn't just being broadcast to the arena anymore. This was going out live to every world in the galactic network. "For 50 years, Jake announced, your council has been feeding people to what is essentially a very large, very lonely dog. And you know what the best part is? He's been secretly helping them escape the whole time, because unlike your leaders, he actually has a conscience." That was Jake's cue. He triggered the final phase of his plan, unlocking the main doors to the council chambers and activating every spotlight in the arena, to point directly at the three aliens who were now trapped between an increasingly angry crowd, and a 12-foot-tall creature who was no longer pretending to be on their side. Time to crash the party. Jake emerged from the maintenance tunnel just as the council chamber doors burst open, and he had to admit the timing was pretty cinematic. Doomclaw had positioned himself perfectly at the main entrance, effectively trapping the three council members on their ornate platform, while thousands of increasingly vocal aliens pressed against the barriers in the viewing areas. The whole galaxy was watching, and Jake could see the view counter on the broadcast climbing into the billions. Apparently, nothing drew an audience quite like watching pompous politicians get their comeuppance from a teenager and his oversized pet. "Jake Martinez, galactic troublemaker, reporting for duty," he announced cheerfully as he walked into the chamber. He'd managed to find some actual clothes in one of the storage rooms, though they were clearly designed for someone with tentacles. Fashion wasn't really his priority right now. Chancellor Vex had turned a particularly vibrant shade of purple that suggested his slime production was working overtime. "You cannot do this. This is a violation of galactic law. This is treason. This is being broadcast live to approximately 3 billion viewers and counting," Jake interrupted, gesturing to the camera feeds he was still controlling. "So maybe choose your next words carefully." Commander Thrak, never one to back down from a fight, stepped forward with his weapon drawn. "Stand down, human. You have no authority here." That was when Doomclaw decided to make his entrance. The massive creature flowed through the doorway with surprising grace, his scales catching the light like black mirrors. He moved with the fluid confidence of a predator who had finally stopped pretending to be something he wasn't. When he reached Jake's side, he sat down with perfect discipline and fixed all three council members with a stare that could have melted steel. "Actually," Jake said conversationally, "I think my friend here outranks all of you. After all, he's the one who's been doing the real work around here for the past 50 years. The crowd noise was getting louder. Through the viewing ports, Jake could see aliens from dozens of different species, and they were not looking happy with their leadership. Signs were starting to appear, hastily made banners demanding answers, calling for justice, asking why their tax money was going to fund elaborate monster theater. You want to know the really funny part about all this? Jake continued, walking closer to the council platform. Doomclaw padded along beside him, close enough that Jake could rest his hand on the creature's flank. I've been here for exactly 2 days, and I've already figured out that your entire government is held together with bureaucratic nonsense and the threat of violence. But here's the thing about threats, they only work if people believe them. Judge Quinn finally found her voice. The creature is dangerous, it has killed dozens of challengers. Have you? Jake asked Doomclaw directly. The massive creature shook his head and made a sound that was unmistakably sad. Then he did something that made the entire galactic audience gasp in unison. He spoke, not in the clicks and rumbles he used with Jake, but in perfectly clear galactic standard, his voice deep and resonant and filled with decades of loneliness. I have never killed anyone, Doomclaw said, and his words carried across the arena and out to every world in the galaxy. I was stolen from my family as a hatchling. I was raised in isolation. I was trained to fight, but I chose to protect instead. The silence that followed was deafening. For 50 cycles, Doomclaw continued. I have helped challengers escape through the hidden passages. I have pretended to be the monster they wanted me to be, because it was easier than watching them feed innocent beings to their cruelty. I have been alone, afraid, and forgotten. Chancellor Vex was making strangled noises. Commander Thrak had lowered his weapon, his face gone pale. Judge Quinn looked like her entire worldview was collapsing in real time. Until Jake, Doomclaw said, turning his massive head to look at his friend. Until someone finally treated me with kindness. Jake scratched behind Doomclaw's ear, and the giant creature leaned into the touch like a cat seeking affection. The image was broadcast to billions of viewers, and Jake could practically hear hearts melting across the galaxy. So here's what's going to happen, Jake announced, turning back to the council. You're going to resign, all 3 of you. Because I've got about 12 hours of security footage showing exactly how your justice systems actually works, and I don't think your constituents are going to be very happy about it. You cannot make demands of the Galactic Council, Vex spluttered. I'm not making demands, Jake replied. I'm making a statement of fact. Look around you. The viewing areas were in chaos. Aliens were shouting, chanting, demanding answers. Security forces had apparently decided that dealing with an angry mob wasn't in their job description, because they were notably absent from the scene. Commander Thrak made one last desperate play, lunging forward with his weapon raised. He got about 3 steps before Doomclaw moved with lightning speed, gently but firmly placing one massive paw on the commander's chest and pressing him back down into a sitting position. Stay, Doomclaw said firmly. Thrak stayed, looking stunned and slightly embarrassed. Good boy, Jake said, and Doomclaw's tail wagged, which was probably the most surreal moment in galactic political history. The crowd loved it. The chanting was getting organized now, and Jake could make out distinct calls for the council's resignation, for Doomclaw's freedom, and surprisingly, for more humans to be brought to the government. You know what the best part about all this is? Jake said, addressing the camera directly. Back on Earth, we have a saying. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Well, it turns out that applies to good creatures too. He gestured to Doomclaw, who had somehow managed to look noble and dignified, despite the fact that he was still gently pinning a military commander to the floor with one paw. Your apex predator spent 50 years protecting people from your justice system. He chose compassion over cruelty, kindness over violence. He's more civilized than your entire government. The view counter had stopped climbing, because it had run out of digits. Jake was pretty sure he was now addressing the largest audience in galactic history. So here's my proposal, he concluded. How about we try a justice system that doesn't involve feeding people to monsters? Revolutionary concept, I know, but I think it might catch on. The resignation of the Galactic Council happened faster than Jake had expected. Apparently, when 3 billion citizens are calling for your head and your approval ratings drop to somewhere below actively malevolent space plague, stepping down becomes less of a choice and more of a survival strategy. Chancellor Vex was the first to crack, his purple slime production reaching critical levels as he blubbered about unprecedented circumstances and the need for new leadership. Commander Thrak followed suit, though he tried to maintain some dignity by claiming he was retiring to pursue other opportunities. Judge Quinn just looked relieved, like she'd been waiting for an excuse to quit for the past century. Within 6 hours, Jake found himself standing in the same council chambers, except now they were packed with representatives from across the galaxy who had somehow managed to organize an emergency session. Doomclaw sat beside him, wearing what Jake had to admit was the most adorable collar in galactic history. It was massive, studded with gems from a dozen different worlds, and bore the inscription Galactic Hero in 17 languages. But Jake's personal favorite touch was the smaller tag that simply read Good Boy. The motion passes unanimously, announced the temporary council speaker, a elderly Centaurian who seemed to be the only politician in the galaxy with actual common sense. The arena-based justice system is hereby abolished, Doomclaw is granted full citizenship and pardons for any alleged crimes, and Jake Martinez is officially appointed as the first human ambassador to the Galactic Council. The applause was thunderous. Jake waved awkwardly, still not entirely sure how spilling coffee had led to becoming a diplomat. Furthermore, the speaker continued. The Council extends an official invitation to Earth to join the Galactic Federation, with full membership benefits, and the understanding that humans will be consulted on all future justice system reforms. Jake leaned over to Doomclaw. Think they're overcompensating a little? Definitely, Doomclaw rumbled back, his tail thumping against the floor. But I like the collar. The media frenzy lasted for weeks. Jake found himself giving interviews to news outlets he'd never heard of, from species he couldn't pronounce. The story of the human and the gentle giant became the most watched broadcast in galactic history, spawning documentaries, children's books, and at least 3 different musical adaptations. Doomclaw became an overnight celebrity. His gentle nature and tragic backstory captured hearts across the galaxy, and Jake lost track of the number of planets that offered to build him mansions, monuments, or his own personal asteroid. But the best part, as far as Jake was concerned, happened 3 months later. He was back at his old job. Technically. The maintenance department of the Galactic Council headquarters had received a significant budget increase and a new mission, ensuring that all government facilities were designed with human-accessible infrastructure and proper safety protocols. Which basically meant Jake got to redesign alien technology to actually make sense. Hand me that plasma wrench, Jake called out, his voice echoing from inside an access panel that had been built for someone with tentacles. A massive claw delicately placed the tool in his outstretched hand. Thanks, buddy. Doomclaw had insisted on staying with Jake, despite offers from literally thousands of worlds to become their planetary mascot. He'd explained, in his careful, thoughtful way, that he'd spent 50 years being what other people wanted him to be. Now he wanted to be what he chose to be. And what he chose to be, apparently, was the galaxy's most overqualified maintenance assistant. You know, Jake said, emerging from the access panel covered in alien grease, I think we make a pretty good team. The best, Doomclaw agreed, carefully holding a bundle of fiber optic cables while Jake sorted through the connections. Though I still think you should ask for a raise. I did. They gave me my own space station. That's not a raise, that's a bribe to keep you from exposing any more government incompetence. Jake considered this. You're probably right, but it's a really nice space station. Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's supervisor, a harried-looking Arcturian who had apparently drawn the short straw when it came to managing the galaxy's most famous maintenance crew. Martinez, the supervisor called out. We've got a situation in the diplomatic quarters. The Zephyrian ambassador is complaining that his quarters are too cold, but every time we adjust the temperature, it sets off the fire suppression system. Jake sighed. Let me guess, someone tried to install a climate control system without considering the atmospheric composition differences between species. How did you know? Lucky guess. Jake stood up and dusted off his hands. Come on, Doomclaw. Let's go save the galaxy from poor engineering again. Should I bring the big wrench or the really big wrench? Doomclaw asked seriously. Better bring both. And maybe some of those universal adapters we designed last week. As they walked through the corridors of the headquarters, Jake couldn't help but smile. 6 months ago, he'd been a nobody maintenance worker whose biggest worry was remembering to clock in on time. Now he was a galactic ambassador with his own diplomatic immunity, and a 12-foot-tall best friend who could bench press a shuttle. It wasn't the career path he'd planned, but he had to admit it had its perks. Hey Doomclaw. Yes? Next time I spill coffee on something important, remind me to aim for the really expensive stuff. Apparently it pays better. Doomclaw's laughter rumbled through the corridor, and Jake couldn't think of a single thing he'd change about how everything had turned out. Well, except maybe asking for that raise after all.